Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us as we discuss an important topic, cannabis social equity in the city of Santa Monica. I'm Kyle Tankard, and I lead cannabis policy work at SCI Consulting Group, and I'm excited to educate the community about cannabis equity and to hear your thoughts on how we can develop an equity program here in Santa Monica. A quick word about who we are. SCI is a consulting firm out of Fairfield, California, that has been helping cities, counties, and public agencies across California with their policy and funding needs for nearly 4 decades. The city brought us on board to help develop what we call a cannabis equity assessment. Essentially, it's a detailed study that looks at how past cannabis policies and enforcement have impacted different communities in Santa Monica. The findings will help us understand what components are needed to guide the city in creating a local cannabis equity program that addresses these historical impacts. So we have two main goals. First, we want to educate the community about cannabis equity and walk you through the assessment that we've been working on. So we'll be sharing some key findings from that assessment. Following that, we'll dive into a discussion on the common barriers to enter in the cannabis industry and explore the potential strategies to structure the city's equity program in a way that reduces or eliminates those barriers for individuals disproportionately impacted by cannabis policies. Finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion on next steps and how you can get involved in this process. So to begin, let's talk about what we mean when we say cannabis social equity and why it matters to this community. The history of cannabis prohibition in California and across the country isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how yesterday's policies continue to impact people's lives today. For decades, communities of color have shouldered the heaviest burden of cannabis enforcement. So we're talking about individuals, families, and communities who've faced not just legal consequences, but ripple effects that touch everything from job opportunities to education to economic stability. And these aren't just statistics. They're people in this community whose lives have been fundamentally altered. When California legalized adult use cannabis back in 2016, it created an opportunity to right some of these historical wrongs. But over the last 8 years, what we've learned is that simply making cannabis legal is not enough. Many of the same community members who were most harmed by prohibition are now finding themselves locked out of the legal industry due to lack of resources, technical knowledge, or the lingering effects of past convictions. So, what are we trying to achieve with cannabis equity programs? There are three main goals. First, it's about economic justice. We want to provide real, practical support to help people from these impacted communities not just enter the cannabis industry, but actually succeed in it. The second piece, we need to tackle the barriers head on, whether it's lack of access to capital, complex regulations, or social stigma. These are all real obstacles that have kept many people out of the industry, and we really need to address them. Finally, and this is crucial, we're talking about community reinvestment. It's about making sure that resources and opportunities flow back into the very communities that were most affected by cannabis arrests and convictions over the years. So as the city works to develop an adult use cannabis program, we want to make sure that people in communities who bore the brunt of cannabis enforcement get a real chance to benefit from today's legal industry, whether that's through business ownership, good jobs, or other opportunities. It's about more than cannabis. It's about addressing decades of inequity and creating pathways to success. So in 2018, the state of California passed the Cannabis Equity Act, which provides grant funding to help local jurisdictions create and implement cannabis equity programs. Santa Monica has already secured an initial grant to conduct a cannabis equity assessment and to develop its local equity program. And if we do this right, the city will be in a strong position to receive additional state funding. These resources can provide equity applicants with crucial access to capital, technical assistance, regulatory compliance support, ensuring that they have the tools and resources needed to enter the legal cannabis industry. So before we get into the details of the equity assessment, let me give you a quick timeline of how cannabis regulation has evolved here in Santa Monica. The city's first step into cannabis regulation came in June of 2015. Back then, we were only talking about medical cannabis or medicinal cannabis, as it's officially called. The city allowed at that time for two medicinal cannabis retailers in the city through its zoning ordinance update. That was it. No other cannabis businesses were allowed at that time. Then in late 2016, when California voters passed Proposition 64, which legalized recreational cannabis across the state, Santa Monica responded to this change in October of 2017 by passing what we call an interim zoning ordinance, or IZO for short. This ordinance did a few important things. First, it set up regulations for medicinal cannabis retailers as well as light manufacturing, so that's non-volatile manufacturing, and made sure the city was in line with the new state laws and regulations that were adopted. And this is important, it specifically didn't allow any adult use or recreational cannabis businesses in the city. So following that IZO, the city went through a careful selection process for those two medicinal retailers that I mentioned earlier. Then in July of 2022, the city council put Measure HMP on the ballot. So this was a proposed tax structure for cannabis businesses, so a cannabis business tax. And the voters had a clear opinion about it. They approved it in November 2022 with a pretty strong margin of 66% to 34%. Next, in June of 2023, the City Council held a study session about adult use cannabis. During this study session, the council made some decisions about the future of cannabis in Santa Monica. They gave direction to staff to open the city to all types of adult use cannabis businesses, not just retail. They also gave two specific directives, one of which is relevant to our discussion tonight. First, create a way for the existing medicinal retailers to sell adult use cannabis. And second, develop a social equity program to ensure communities most impacted by past cannabis enforcement can benefit from this industry. Since then, the city has been working on a ordinance and studying equity programs in other cities. Lastly, in November of 2023, the council passed another interim ordinance allowing the two medicinal retailers to begin adult use sales, which was extended last December. And that brings us to today as we work to shape Santa Monica's cannabis equity program. So let me walk you through how we're going about creating Santa Monica's equity program. We've broken it down into four main steps, and I want to explain why each one matters. First, we start with outreach and education, which is exactly what we're doing here with today's meeting. We need to hear from you, the community, to understand your perspectives, concerns, and needs. Second, we conduct what we call a cannabis equity assessment. Think of this as our research and analysis phase, where we dig deep into the data and the community input to really understand what's needed here in Santa Monica. These first two steps actually work hand in hand. Your input directly shapes our assessment, and the assessment findings help us shape the recommendations for the city's program. Then comes step three, program development. This is where we take everything we've learned and turn it into actual policy and program features. Then finally, step four is implementation. Put in the program into action. So right now we're focused on the first two critical steps. The insights we gather here will help us design a program that truly works for Santa Monica, one that opens doors for people who have been left out of the cannabis industry and creates real opportunities for success. So now that we've outlined the overall development process, let me tell you about where we are right now in our outreach efforts and how you can still get involved. So we kicked this off a few months ago with an online survey that's helping us understand the community's thoughts about cannabis equity. Good news, if you haven't taken it yet, there's still time. We really want to hear from as many community members as possible. This meeting is our next big step, so we want to hear directly from you. Again, your ideas, your concerns, and your vision for what equity could look like in Santa Monica's cannabis industry. After this, we'll be sitting down one-on-one with key community members and stakeholders to dig in even deeper. So every bit of feedback, whether it's through the survey, tonight's discussion, our upcoming interviews, will help shape our equity assessment and recommendations we make to the city. So we want to make sure that you can easily stay connected with everything that is happening in this process. So the city went ahead and set up a dedicated cannabis equity page where you'll find all the latest updates about our assessment work, plus a direct link to that survey I just mentioned. So if you haven't checked it out, please go to the city's website at www.santamonica.gov/cannabis-social-equity. There you'll find a lot of useful information as well as links to the city's main cannabis page, so past council meetings, all that information. In addition, to make sure that you don't miss out on any updates, the city will also be sharing news through the city's newsletter, as well as email notifications. So in parallel with our outreach efforts, we're currently preparing a written cannabis equity assessment report. The primary goal of this assessment is to examine the historical impact of cannabis-related policies and enforcement on communities within Santa Monica by analyzing police records, demographic data, poverty levels, and other relevant factors. The assessment aims to identify which communities have been disproportionately impacted and uncover the common barriers they face in accessing the legal cannabis industry. The findings from this assessment will directly shape our recommendations for Santa Monica's equity program, everything from who qualifies for assistance to what kinds of support they'll receive. Plus, having this assessment completed puts the city in a strong position to secure additional state funding, which means more resources to support this community and community members who want to enter the cannabis industry. So let's take a look at the preliminary findings from the equity assessment. The city's population tells us an important story about the city. So 69% of the residents identify as white, making it the largest demographic group. 17% identify as Hispanic or Latino. Asian residents make up about 9% of this community, and African American residents represent 5% of the population. The city has smaller communities of American Indian, Alaskan Native residents at just under 1%, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander residents at 0.1%. So really understanding the city's demographic makeup is crucial because it helps us identify any gaps between who lives here and who has been most impacted by cannabis enforcement, which I'll share with you in just a moment. So as part of our analysis, we examined historical cannabis-related arrest data in Santa Monica from 1993 to 2023. During this 30-year period, a total of 2,229 cannabis-related arrests were recorded across the city. So as you can see in this graph, the number of arrests has fluctuated over time. The peak years were in 2004 and 2007 with 157 and 173 arrests respectively. And this timeline is significant because in 2006, the city adopted a landmark piece of legislation, an ordinance establishing Chapter 3.72 in the city code. This ordinance deprioritized law enforcement for marijuana offenses involving personal adult use, essentially making such investigations, citations, arrests, property seizures, and even prosecutions the lowest law enforcement priority for the city of Santa Monica. Following this policy shift and after the legalization of cannabis in 2016, cannabis-related arrests have significantly decreased, reflecting both the evolving cannabis laws and a broader change in enforcement practices, not only here in Santa Monica, but also statewide. So let's look at what types of cannabis offenses people were actually being arrested for during this period. So the data tells a pretty striking story. So most arrests weren't for major cannabis operations. They were for possession of less than an ounce of cannabis. The next most common arrests were for possession with intent to sell, followed by DUI cases. So why is this significant for our equity work? Because these arrests for simple possession, which comprised the majority of cases, have had severe and lasting consequences, often resulting in misdemeanor, felony charges, and even incarceration for some. Next, I'll show you the types of cannabis arrests and how they've changed over time in Santa Monica. So you'll notice the blue line on this graph, which represents arrests for simple possession. Basically, people arrested for having cannabis for personal use. So you can see a dramatic drop after 2017. Again, this wasn't by accident. Remember that ordinance we just talked about earlier, Chapter 3.72? That's when the city made cannabis enforcement its lowest priority. Then when California legalized adult use cannabis in 2016, you'll notice these arrests fell even further. There's another important trend to note here. While most types of cannabis arrests have continued to decline, we're actually seeing an increase in DUI cases. This highlights the ongoing importance of responsible cannabis use, even in a legal market. So now this next part of our findings is particularly important as it reveals some stark disparities in how cannabis enforcement affected different communities in Santa Monica. When we compared arrest rates to the city's demographics, we found some troubling patterns. While Black residents make up 5% of Santa Monica's population, they accounted for 26% of all cannabis-related arrests. So let that sink in. That's nearly 5 times higher than their representation in this community. Hispanic and Latino residents also experience disproportionate enforcement, being arrested at about 1.5 times their population rate. Looking at the other demographic groups in the city, they were arrested at rates well below their population size. So really these numbers tell us something crucial. The negative impacts of cannabis enforcement was not felt equally across this community. This is exactly why we're here tonight, because understanding these disparities is essential to creating an equity program that actually addresses historical wrongs and creates meaningful opportunities for those most impacted. So next, let me explain how we identified which communities in Santa Monica have been most impacted by cannabis enforcement. We looked at three key factors that research shows are closely connected to cannabis criminalization. First, we looked at communities of color, particularly Black and Hispanic and Latino populations, since they have historically experienced higher rates of cannabis-related arrests and harsher penalties despite similar usage rates across racial and ethnic groups. Second, we examined income levels. Why? Because historically, low-income areas have faced higher rates of cannabis-related arrests and enforcement. Third, we considered education levels. Populations with lower educational attainment levels often face fewer economic opportunities and are more vulnerable to long-term impacts of cannabis-related arrests. By mapping these three factors against our arrest data, we can identify areas where residents may have experienced disproportionate harm. Let me walk you through these series of three important maps that show us where cannabis enforcement has had the biggest impact in Santa Monica. The purple dots you see represent cannabis, the location of cannabis arrests, and we've overlaid this with census data showing where people of color live in the city. So what stands out immediately is a clear pattern. The Pico neighborhood shown in red on the map has both the highest concentration of people of color, between 51 and 67% of residents, and a significant cluster of cannabis arrests. We also see a lot of arrests along the coastline in downtown areas of Santa Monica. Now, while this makes some sense given these are high traffic tourist areas, it's important to note that these areas also have larger populations of people of color than other parts of the city. In contrast, look at the areas shown in green. These are neighborhoods with lower percentages of people of color. You'll notice significantly fewer arrest dots in these areas. This mapping helps us understand not just who was impacted by cannabis enforcement, but where in the city these impacts were felt most strongly. This kind of data is crucial for making sure this equity program reaches the communities that need it most. So our second map shows another important pattern, how cannabis arrests lined up with household income levels across Santa Monica. What we're seeing here really enforces what we found in our first map, the Pico neighborhood in downtown areas where we saw high numbers of arrests, also have some of the highest concentration of low-income households. About 1/3 of the residents, or between 32 and 38% of those residents in the downtown area in the Pico neighborhood have low-income households. Compare that to the areas in green. These neighborhoods have both fewer low-income households and, as you can see from the purple dots, fewer cannabis arrests. This overlap between income levels and arrest patterns isn't a coincidence. It's another piece of evidence showing how cannabis enforcement disproportionately affected this city's more economically vulnerable communities. And then our final map completes an important picture by looking at education levels across Santa Monica, specifically focusing on adults without a high school diploma. So while Santa Monica generally has high education levels, again, we're seeing a consistent pattern emerge. The Pico neighborhood, which we've already identified as having higher concentrations of both people of color and low-income households, also shows the lowest education attainment levels. About 10 to 13% of adults there haven't completed high school. Um, so this creates what we call a compounding effect, where multiple barriers or factors often intersect in the same neighborhoods. Um, these three maps together tell a powerful story about how cannabis enforcement impacted specific communities in Santa Monica. They show us that it just wasn't about race or just about income or just about education. It was often all three factors working together. And then lastly, I'll show you how we identified the areas of Santa Monica that were most impacted by cannabis enforcement. This table on the left here really brings together everything we've been looking at in those maps. When we ranked the census tracts by their arrest rates, a clear pattern emerged. The Pico neighborhood and the downtown areas didn't just have high arrest numbers, they also consistently show higher percentages of people of color, more low income households, and lower education levels. What makes this data so important is that it's not just showing us random patterns, it's revealing specific neighborhoods where multiple challenges overlapped. So now I would like to highlight some of the major barriers that individuals face when trying to enter the regulated cannabis industry. We have identified five main types of barriers, and understanding these barriers are crucial for building an effective equity program. First, let's talk money, because this is often the biggest roadblock for anyone. Starting a cannabis business is not cheap. You need capital for real estate, licensing fees, taxes, and operations. For many potential business owners, especially those with past convictions, just getting a business loan or even signing a lease can be nearly impossible. Second are what we call technical barriers. Think about it. Running any business is challenging, but cannabis businesses face extra layers of complex regulations at both state and local levels. Without business experience or industry knowledge, navigating these requirements can be challenging. Third are criminal barriers. Past convictions, which we know disproportionately affected communities of color, continue to impact people's lives today. Even though cannabis is now legal, these past records can still close doors to opportunities in the industry. Fourth are regulatory barriers. These include restrictive laws, zoning regulations, and limitations on the number of permits available. In many areas, strict zoning laws make it difficult to find compliant locations for cannabis businesses, and caps on the number of permits or licenses can limit entry into the market. These regulations favor well-resourced companies and create significant hurdles for equity applicants trying to break into the industry. Finally, there's something less visible but just as real: social barriers. Many community members, especially those who faced aggressive enforcement in the past, understandably have deep mistrust of the government and government programs. So we need to acknowledge this history and actively work to rebuild trust if we want this equity program to succeed. Based on what we've learned from equity programs across California, I want to walk you through some potential solutions we're considering to break down those barriers we just talked about. First up is financial assistance. So this will be crucial for helping equity applicants succeed. Loan or grant programs are a great way to provide critical financial support. So low interest loans or zero interest loans to help cover startup costs, licensing fees, and other big expenses that often block equity applicants from getting started. So as loans are repaid, the funds can be reinvested back into the program. And then for even more support, grant programs could offer non-repayable funds to help people from marginalized communities establish and sustain their cannabis businesses. But as we know, financial support alone is not enough. We also need to address gaps in knowledge and experience. That's where a comprehensive technical assistance program could come in. So essentially, this is a program that would offer business development services, specialized training, and legal assistance tailored to equity applicants. The idea here is to give them the skills and resources that they need to launch and manage successful cannabis businesses. So this program could include a detailed curriculum covering everything from business planning and financial management to marketing, regulatory compliance, and operations. Plus, beyond the initial training, we'd suggest ongoing support like mentorship with experienced operators, access to industry experts, networking events, and even legal guidance. It's all about helping equity applicants navigate the complexities of the cannabis industry and setting them up for long-term success. Now, while we're getting more people, or excuse me, while getting more people into business ownership is key, we also need to think about workforce development. We want to make sure that the industry has skilled local employees, that people in this community have access to good, well-paying jobs. A workforce training program could prepare individuals for various roles in the cannabis industry with job-specific training, professional development, and hands-on experience. This would help economically disadvantaged residents have access to high-quality jobs and ensure that Santa Monica's cannabis industry is inclusive and sustainable. And finally, we can't forget about those past cannabis convictions. So we're looking at ways to address this through local record expungement programs paired with ongoing community outreach and education. So let's talk about one of the most important pieces of this program, deciding who qualifies for these equity benefits. So this isn't just about checking boxes, it's making sure that this program reaches the people who need it the most. So we really have to get this right. If we make the eligibility requirements too strict, we might miss people who truly deserve the support. Too loose, we risk helping those who really don't need the support, taking resources away from those who do. So here are the main factors we're considering. First, cannabis conviction history. So not just the applicant who is applying for the equity program, but possibly including their immediate family members too. We know these convictions have impacted entire families, not just individuals. Second is income level, because we want to help those facing real financial barriers to enter in the industry. Third is residency requirements. So really thinking about how to prioritize the local community members. And then fourth is ownership structure. making sure equity applicants have real control and actually benefit from their businesses. And then finally, we're looking to or looking at creating different tiers of eligibility, because we know not everyone's situation fits into a single category. So essentially, with tiers of eligibility, applicants would be set in different tiers based on the level of impact that they have faced, and then prioritizing assistance to those applicants based on their impact. So next, I will wrap up by sharing what's coming next in this process and how you can stay involved. So over the next couple of months, we'll be sitting down for one-on-one conversations with community members and stakeholders to get a deeper understanding of their perspectives. So if you'd like to be a part of these discussions, please let me know or city staff know. We're currently in the process of building our list of participants right now. Next, mark your calendars for January, when we'll hold our second community meeting. That's when we'll get into the specifics of what Santa Monica's cannabis equity program could look like, based on everything we've learned. So please be on the lookout for sometime in early December when we nailed down the exact date and location for that meeting in January. And then lastly, we're aiming to have the final equity assessment report ready early next year. So this report will pull together all our research, any input that we receive, and then our recommendations for the city moving forward. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I just want to take a moment to sincerely thank all of you for taking the time to listen to this presentation and also engaging with this important topic. If you're interested in getting more involved, whether that's participating in our stakeholder interviews or sharing more of your thoughts, our contact information is right here on the screen. And don't forget about that survey. You can easily access that by scanning the QR codes listed on this slide. And so as we conclude this meeting, remember that your voices and experiences are essential in creating a cannabis equity program that truly works for Santa Monica. Together, we have an opportunity to right historical wrongs and build a more inclusive cannabis industry in this city. So thanks again to everyone for being a part of this conversation. Thank you so much.